When it comes to looking at the history and the culture of hotels in this country, we have an enormous amount of hotels to be able to draw from because our history is interwoven with the history of our hotels. But what we're talking about today is specifically Queen Victoria's grand old ladies. It's not a random thought. It's something that once you start looking at the date lines of when our hotels really became part of the history, the big ones from the past, you'll see how they all intertwine with the history of the Victorian era. And that was not by coincidence. It's because of what was going on in South Africa at the same time and what was going on in England. So what I'm going to share with you today is how those stories intertwine, and more importantly, which of the old grand ladies from the Victorian era still stand, and have a look at how they go back in the time of the history. Before I launch into the stories of the hotels, I should probably just tell you why I'm so fascinated in them. It's not just a random point of interest, although history is something that I absolutely love. The real trigger for me has been in the last probably about 6 years. I've been had the privilege actually and the joy of being involved in something called showcook.com. Now, if you look at the photograph down the bottom left-hand side, that little lady there in red and blue is Annette Kessler. Some of you might recognize her. She used to be the food editor of Fair Lady magazine some time ago. And these days, she's positively the doyen of the hotel and hospitality industry. And together with Chania Moritz Smith, which is the lady with her in that photograph, the two of these women are the most dynamic duo that has put mentorship into the center of their being. It is an enormous mentorship challenge, and it's a big pay it forward thing because you'll see the kind of people you see in the photographs: executive chefs, sommeliers, general managers of hotels, people who produce the food that feeds into the hotel industry. Everybody's involved in hospitality has more than a passing interest in making sure that we have the right kind of skill set in place for the next generation of hospitality stars. And it's these two that have kind of formalized it. And it's been turned into an annual challenge, one of which is between the culinary academies and the other which is between the hotels. At the end of it, the chefs, the pastry chefs, the wine stewards, all the ones that win have the most extraordinary change of life experience. And my own role is I go with them as master of ceremonies for all the big events that we do around the country and sometimes represent them in the media. But mainly why do I stay there is because I have a front row seat for watching what these extraordinary people in the hospitality industry do in order to make sure that we have that level of skills ahead. And it is a huge privilege. Every time I get up on my feet to do a master of ceremonies job, I find out about the history of the hotel that I'm actually involved in. And that's kind of where the bug bit. Every time I get the history, I kind of go, wow, that is so interesting. And at the end of it, I've acquired for myself almost like a bird's eye view of what these hotels are about and where they intertwine with the history. So that's the background that tells you why I'm actually so interested in it. Now I'd like to share some of it with you, specifically through the eyes of the Queen Victoria and her Victorian era. Before we launch off about Queen Victoria's specific legacy, I just need to take a second and go right back into the history of hospitality. The word hospice, French word, and it literally means taking care of travelers. That's where we get the word from. No surprise, the earliest of our hospitality industry lies in the hands of the photograph or the image on the right-hand side, which is the ancient Greeks. And I'm going right back, maybe 13, 14, 15 centuries BC. They're also the ones that started the idea of washing your feet of your travelers when they arrive. You'll be relieved to know we don't do that anymore in the year 2022. But they're the ones who put it on the map. And the kind of guests that they had were more governmental and officials than they were sort of festive and holidays. There was purpose and there was reason, and they had to be looked after. The Romans took it, as only the Romans can do, to the next level. So again, you had the government officials, you had people who were moving around, but they kind of took it to the next level in terms of eating and drinking and being merry. And it might interest you to know that it was the Romans who introduced the concept of thermal baths in England and Switzerland and the Middle East, and that was around about the 8th century BC. So speaking of the Middle East, if you look back in time to this era, and we're sort of talking now about the 3rd century BC, and they were known for their caravanserai. Think Silk Road, which was kind of the kind of hospitality that was offered between Turkey through to China. Most of the people who did the traveling, if not all, were merchants on the move. So there was a lot of exchanging of talk and of actual products and items in these lodgings. So the hospitality was aimed at looking after those people who were doing their trade along the road. But there is one extraordinary story which I must share with you, a hotel that's still standing. And it's been recognized in the Guinness World Book of Records as being the oldest continuously running hotel in the world. It dates back to the 8th century AD. So we're talking about specifically the year 705. It's called Nishiyama Onsen Kayunkan. It is near Mount Fuji. And if I'm looking at that photograph, I'm thinking perhaps that Uber wouldn't have a merry time of trying to get people there, but they still do. 52, maybe not Uber, but people certainly go there. 52 generations of the same family have owned and still continue to run this hotel. It's quite an extraordinary place in the culture and the history of our hotels. Back to the Western civilization, what made the huge difference with the growth of the hotels and the hospitality industry were coaches, transport, in other words, which back then would have been mainly by coaches. But quite quickly during this time, and we're talking kind of 5th, 10th century AD going forward into the 12th century, throughout that whole space of time, travel just kind of grew and distances became longer, travelers went further. It wasn't just about government business and mail. It was also about sending messages, getting to see family. So the whole nature of hospitality was rapidly changing. Now, the oldest lodge in England that dates back to the year 1135 is this beautiful looking establishment, Oldie Bell, in England, and it's incredible. It first opened its doors, as I said, in 1135, and it's still serving customers in England. The hospitality industry hangs in there. There were obviously many, many stories, many hotels, but I want to swiftly move you across to France, which is one of my most favorite parts of the hospitality industry. But I'm going to zone in on one man, Monsieur Boulanger. M. Boulanger. Now, as you probably know, boulanger is basically a baker. It's French word for baker. But this individual has his place in history, not so much for baking, but because of being a bit crafty. At that time, and we're talking 1756, the industry had started to formalize itself. It knew and understood that there was money to be made, and they started forming unions. So you had the winemakers union, you had the meat union, you had all the vegetable unions. And it simply meant that if you were going to sell those kind of products or offer hospitality in that name, you had to pay your dues. And M. Boulanger was decided that wasn't a good idea. He didn't want to pay his dues. So his speciality was soup. And he realized that there was no guild for soups. So if you then operate an establishment with something where there was no guild, no dues to be paid. So this very clever fellow did exactly that. And his main offering, this offering of the day, if you like, was always sheep hooves. Hate to think what that tasted like. But he claimed that it had restorative properties. So you can see his establishment on the left-hand side of my image, but he hung a sign above his door saying restoratives, which eventually became restaurants. So this fella was the person, the founder, if you like, of the restaurant tradition in the rest of the world. But we are focused today on Queen Victoria, Princess Alexandrina Victoria, born in the year 1819, who was to become a teenage queen. She was only 18 years old when she was crowned the Queen of England in 1837. It was the most extraordinary era in history. The Victorian era was the time of change, of technology, of growth, of innovation. And when I look at the hotel and hospitality time, the things that happened during this time, I don't think it was because she liked food so much, but there was definitely something there that kind of made her more interested to support it. Queen Victoria loved food. If you look at her journals and read up her diaries about it, this lady ate from morning through until night. There's stories about her going off to theatre, for example. So she'd had a good lunch and a good dinner, and then she got her manservant to pack a picnic basket, lest she get hungry during the theatre performance. Except when you read what was in that basket for the theatre performance, it would be enough to feed a small family of 12 people. Extraordinary. She had a mighty appetite. So what were the hotels that were formed in England? And I'd like you to particularly to have a look at the style and the architecture, and then remember what they look like when I take you over to South Africa. Interestingly, a lot of them, not all of them, were built because of the, again, transport, the railways that were going up or were running at that time. And I've chosen 3 or 4 of them just to show you because they had direct bearing on the architecture that we had in South Africa. So in 1854, the Great Northern Hotel London was one of the first ones, a great slab of building that went up. This is what it looks like today. And if you look on the extreme right-hand side of the big photographs, there is the building, slightly curved, which you can now see very, very clearly in this photograph. But now, modern day, that's the railway station. And over that whole area is that big dome, which if you peek underneath it, looks like that. Talk about the new meets the old, an incredible piece of architecture of old days and to today. King's Cross and Pancras stations, if you're interested, that's the railway stations that it's built over. My second example is Langham Hotel. It was built and opened its doors in 1865, designed by a chap called John Giles. And it was one of the first to be purpose-built to be a grand hotel, opened by Queen Victoria's son, the Prince of Wales, and its claim to fame was the beginning of this technology drive. It had 100 water closets, toilets. It had 36 bathrooms. It had the first hydraulic lifts to be installed. It was also in the year 1879, the first to use electricity for lighting, but only in the lobby and the courtyard, not yet in the rooms. That was to come much later on. That's the foyer as it was back then in the Victorian era and as it is today. And seems to me that every Victorian hotel had a palm court, and there was theirs, and that's what it looks like today. Here's the dining area. Have a look in particular at the roof structure and the decoration. The photograph on the extreme right is the modern day as it stands, and it's always a point of pleasure for me to see how much they've tried to retain that Victorian sort of opulence that was so indicative of that time. My next hotel is Charing Cross, another hotel that was built around railways, 1865, and today it is the Claremont Hotel. Hasn't changed too much. You can see some changes in the style. And I've got one photograph to show you what it looks like inside. The architect was Edward Middleton Barry, who was a very busy architect during that time, together with his brother Barry, actually. Edward was also the architect of the Covent Gardens Royal Opera House, so he was quite busy. His aim was to build hotels to rival what was now the thing, which is other railway hotels. This particular one was over King's Cross and Paddington, and very, very ornate. Its style, just to flip you back, was the Franco-Italian style. My next hotel is the Midland Grand Hotel of 1873. If you look at that building, you might be forgiven for thinking you're looking at the Houses of Parliament, and you're not wrong, for it was exactly the same architect that came up with this one. They called it the Venetian Gothic style. Outside, it looked like that. That's what it looks like today. It really is a sort of Gothic feel to it. But the real excitement about this one is have a look at what it looks like inside. Look at the incredible arches, very indicative of Victorian era. That first image on the left-hand side, the detail on the ceiling is extraordinary. Lovely part about this one is that they've managed to retain it, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. But again, the Victorian innovation, innovative hydraulic lifts. Every room had a fireplace. They made use for the first time of concrete floors. Revolving doors popped up for the first time. Flushing toilets. It cost 3.5 shillings a night to stay there. So it was definitely aimed at the Victorian era elite. But look how beautiful it looks today. Now, look again at that photograph I've got on the right-hand side of the Victorian original hotel. And there it is again on the right-hand side. They've gone to huge efforts to retain it, although you could be forgiven for thinking that you've stepped into a hotel in Istanbul. The opulence and the color and the detail with the gold leaf is on show in this particular hotel. The Great Eastern Hotel, which is now called the Andaz Hotel, Liverpool Street, was erected and opened its doors in 1884. There it is on the left as it was when it opened and as it looks today. And there again is the before and after, if you like, the Victorian era. And you can see very, very clearly in the Victorian picture versus the modern day how they've kept that detailed skylight that was part of the Victorian era. Charles Barry Jr. completed the architecture working with his brother Edward Barry. And in fact, this hotel opened its doors after Edward had died. And to complete my examples of the London Victorian hotels, could not possibly leave out the Savoy. Opened its doors in 1899. That was an important year. It was an important year for us in South Africa, as you'll hear me say later on. That was the year that Mount Nelson opened its doors, and it was also the year that the Anglo-Boer War started, which was to have incredible impact on the hotel industry. The Savoy was the society hotel, absolutely incredible piece. And it was to be the leading light of architecture during its time. It was also known for its iconic partnership between Monsieur César Ritz and Chef Escoffier, who were to change the whole shape of the way things was done inside the kitchen, the way it was served. They were to change the way ladies, for example, were to be encouraged into the lounges, which up until then, by the way, hadn't been happened. It wasn't the done thing. If you were a lady of nobility or gentry, you certainly didn't hang in hotels until these two started cracking the formula of being able to put together the proper tea and offering that would entice these ladies with their big hats. That's what it looked like then. That's what it looks like now. And if you're curious, that's Stephen Fry who's hopping out the car in front of the entrance. Again, the lobby, then and now. I love the fact that they have gone to great pains to keep the pillars, even though it does look a little different in style, but also look at the floor. Even underneath the carpets, you can see the difference. The floor has been retained, as have the ceilings and the light details. They're still there, renovated no doubt, but still operating. There's the ubiquitous Palm Court, the Thames Foyer as they call it then, and the same area now, and the same with the River Restaurant, the dining area. You can see the Victorian era as it stood on the left, and an etching or a painting, I suppose, from that period of time, and as it looks like today, somewhat different. This was the era of high society, dances, celebration, and the Savoy Hotel was a leader in all of them. And it was this sense of society and dancing and eating that attracted the attention of some of the leading lights of the hospitality industries, the future hoteliers in South Africa. So now let's move our story to South Africa. Before we go into the Victorian era, I want to take you back to the early days of the Cape Colony in order to show you where hospitality actually started. Remember, we're a port down here in Cape Town, and right from the beginning, we were about ships that arrived and left and arrived and left. So there was a business opportunity right from day one. I love this image, by the way, slightly a bit of artistic license on how the mountains looked. We're back in the day of Jan van Riebeeck, and in 1656, the Lords 17, the masters of the Dutch East India Company, declared we need treatment and accommodation for the coming and going of people, because they quickly realized that this was a port with that business opportunity. By the time Jan van Riebeeck left, And he kept asking to leave, by the way. I found that quite interesting. In his journals and letters, he was basically saying, get me out of this place. But he found it very difficult despite his place in history. But he managed, by the time he left in that year, to leave behind him a tiny hamlet with 4 proper streets, 4 inns, and what he called 381 eaters. His word, not mine. So even back then, Cape Town was a community of people who like to eat in restaurants and wine and dine. Now, the first lodging was put up by a lady called Anneke Boom, who was the wife of the gardener, the official landscaper, who was responsible for the company gardens in Cape Town. I love the fact that our gardener was called Mr. Boom, but that's what happened. And it was his wife, Anneke, who opened up a lodging inside the castle area. The second one to open up a lodge was another lady called Janneke Boudijs van Doesburg, who was the wife of the sergeant. And Jan van Riebeek wrote into her contract specifically the words, "You may open the inn, but not to be permitted to corrupt the good folk of the fort." And he used the literal word with no debaucherie, which is a French-Dutch word. They were very wary about what inns would do to the good people of the Cape Colony. And then the third license went to adopted, believe it or not. You got the tap license. And the fourth one was called the Tavern of the Seas, a name to be reproduced many times over. And that's the kind of thing that the Taverns of the Seas and the first tap license areas looked like. The earliest proper hotels, and I'm going to share with you just a couple of them, just to sort of put it into context before we come forward to the opulence of the Victorian design, looked very different back then. The very first one was in Stellenbosch. We know it as Eau de Verf, but back then it was called de Ouverwerf, which translates into the Old Yard, 1682. At the order of Simon van der Stel, a church was erected, and it was a thatch roof. That was it on the left-hand side. And this hotel has its history in fire, for this beautiful little hotel was to burn down rather tragically. And when it was resurrected, it was deconsecrated, and in its place was built an inn. There's some images showing what it looked like inside. And this hotel was to be destroyed by fire again and again. There were 3 different occasions when this same building was destroyed by fire, 1802 and then eventually 1882. So it kind of died down, came up, died up again, but it was always a tavern after it was deconsecrated, coming forward to modern history until 1973. And in 1973, the then owner, Gerard Lubbe, created it more or less as it stands right now with the name Eau de Verf. And it doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to a family called the Petrussus family, Swiss family of hoteliers. And you're going to hear me mention them again because they also own the Vineyard Hotel. The remains of the history and the culture of this part are pretty lost, I'm afraid, as the modern culture has gone forward. What I do know is that the remnants of the churchyard, the graveyard specifically, remain underneath the kitchen, ironically, of this deconsecrated graveyard, but they still sit there. That's some of the images of what it looks like, and you can see they've tried to sort of hold on to some of the remnants of its history, but mainly it's a very, very modern hotel. The next one was built in 1781 and is smack in the middle of Cape Town, right in the main streets. And it used to be Heritage Square, a very important meeting place for the Cape Colony. It was a marketplace. So into this particular block, and it is an entire block, and that's a terrible image, I know, very grainy, but I've used it because for me it's just so fascinating to remind yourself what was once there in this area. There were snuff makers, there were gunsmiths, there were bakers, there were coach makers, wheelwrights, a rope warehouse, and what amuses me, a chapel and an undertaker, turnkey operation in one area. That was where the hotel stood when it was built in 1781, and the foundations are exactly the same, and so is this vine. This vine started its life out in 1781, and the modern hotel still keeps it and looks after it and prunes it, and it's very much part of the historical offering that is there. In 1760, You know, modern civilization moves on, and the municipality of Cape Town decided, no, bring the hotel down. We are going to build ourselves a multi-level car park. Went through all the phases. Funds were secured, and then all of a sudden they ran out of funds, thank goodness, and the hotel just went into sort of disrepair until the late 1980s, when a remarkable group of people turned it into the largest private conservation project within this particular part of the world, and it became reborn again as the Cape Heritage Hotel. That's what it looks like today. The rooms are obviously all completely modernized, but they have hung on to that old style. The lady in the photograph on the right-hand side is Victoria Engelhorn. She's Spanish. She comes from a family of hoteliers, a lady who's we have paths across actually many times because her son and my son were at school together. But this hotel in Cape Town is very much one of her places of pride and is absolutely beautiful. And my last hotel to share with you before we actually come right into the Victorian era, it just had to be shown. It's the same hotel that was named for the first time after Queen Victoria, the Royal Hotel of Riebeek Kasteel. Riebeek Kasteel and Riebeek itself, Riebeek West, are two of the very oldest towns in South Africa. They date way back to 1600 and something. But the hotel was built in 1862. You can see in the photographs it hasn't changed much at all. But its nod to history is interesting in that in 1870, Jan Smuts was born in the area, and 1874, Dali Malan, both future leaders of South Africa to come from this tiny little part of South African history. And so we come to the Victorian era, and that is what Cape Town looked like. That image, by the way, that painting is courtesy of Lady Anne Barnard. We'll talk about her again in a minute. She used to do minuscule, detailed watercolors of what it looked like, which is very fortunate. Taverns and lodges were deplored by the temperance movement. They said billiards and brandy, the two curses of Cape Town, prevail. Personal bathrooms and toilets were not nearly as important as having a jolly good long bar counter. And the style of the time was very much this. It was sort of Art Nouveau, the Victorian love of opulence and detail and balustrades and skylights and bits and pieces on the roof and all the details that you'll see on the hotels that were built now in Cape Town that were built in London. Curved tendril-like lines. Wrought iron was everywhere, brass fittings, and the windows and the rooftops were filled with details. Steeples, spires, balconies, gables spoke the language of the time. So we're going to begin our sharing of the hotels, the big ones, with one that you will not recognize from that image. I'm going to talk first about the President Hotel. Now, the President Hotel was known for most of its history as being the Queen's Hotel, as in Queen Victoria, but it begins right back in history. At the time, Cape Town was developing, the city area, the Cape Colony, and Hout Bay was developing, but in between was nothing. It was just arid. Loads of jackals, loads of lions, loads of leopards, but nothing else in between. And right plonk in the middle of this unlikely tract of ground was the very first origins of the hospitality industry, and it looked like that. It was called Society House, and it was built as a country retreat for the gentry of Cape Town because, believe it or not, they found the dust and the heat of Cape Town far too much to bear. So they would go all the way from Cape Town to what is now Bantry Bay, which, as we know, is not very far away, but this was the rural country, and this was built. It was also known as Heerenhuis, the House of the Gentry. And what is interesting for me is the style. It was very different to the thatched roof places that were going up in Cape Town, and they had the veranda supported by the pillars. Over time, society stayed there for a day, a week, a month. It still wasn't really formalized hotels, but that changed. It became Sea Point House, and then eventually became Sea Point Hotel. And you can see, if I just go back again, there's not too much. The building remained, but they just build up to make it a little bit more sort of a concrete building, if you like, to host their guests. And then it became the Wentworth Hotel in 1880. Again, much of that was retained and it just changed some of the outside decor. It was demolished in 1880, sadly, despite the fact it had one of the largest and most glorious of Victorian long bars that Cape Town could offer. Even the bar wasn't enough to keep it going. And then, on exactly the same footprint, arose the Queen's Hotel in 1887. No coincidence of dates, by the way. That was the Queen's Gold Jubilee year, and everything about the plan was designed to make it open its doors to celebrate. The gentleman on your left has an interesting role to play in the history of the Queen's Hotel. He was the Member of Parliament in Kimberley at the time. He took office in 1897. And this lad had a penchant for the Queen's Hotel. And every single time he visited Cape Town, he would come and book into the same suite until the day came when his suite wasn't available. And he had a hissy fit. And after he'd hit the roof, literally, he did what every guest who can't get their hotel room does. He bought it. He bought the entire hotel outright and took ownership to make sure that he had his favorite suite. And he retained ownership. He died in 1924, still the owner of the Queen's Hotel, and his daughter took over and continued. She renovated, modernized, and this is the hotel in sort of latter day as it went forward. The Queen's Hotel had a long and glorious history. And then, I guess, a couple of things. The Republic of South Africa, we had moved away from the link up with royalty in England, and then it became the proper thing to do was to give it a new name and give it a new facelift. In 1967, the President Hotel was named. Same place, same hotel as the Queen's Hotel. Mediterranean, not much Victorian era in that one. What is still there, even to this day, is the piece of land that goes from the front of the hotel all the way down to the ocean, and they've actually retained that. You can actually sort of see all the way through, although obviously it's very, very built up these days. This is the President Hotel as it exists today, and that was as recent as last week. I took those photographs when I popped in to go and say hi. So it's a beautiful hotel, but you know, it's fascinating that it's got the oldest and most interesting history in the Cape Colony into Cape Town, and yet there's very little to show for it. But they're very proud of their history, so they have a wall of honor there to remind us from whence it came. That's what it looks like inside. Very modern, as you can see, sort of very city lodge-ish in its interior design, but absolutely beautiful. Really is a very modern, lovely hotel. Right, let's go back again to the year 1892. This piece of architecture, which was put together by Antony Mateus de Witt, who was one of the 12, there were 12 brilliant architects of hotels during that time who were responsible for much of what I'm going to tell you about. His style he declared to be German Renaissance. And the details, those are straight from his architectural drawings, mansard roof, the dormer windows, the pediments, the corner tower, all of it through, even the stonework. This is how he envisaged his hotel. The detail was very specific and it never saw the light of day. It was called the Hamburg Hotel. By the time it opened its doors in 1894, it was the Metropole. You wouldn't say so from that photograph. That's the only one I can find actually about the Metropole, but in its time it was highly innovative in Cape Town. It was in fact a city landmark, possibly because of the way it was also built. There was a steel framework. It had for the first time cast concrete floors. It pioneered high-rise buildings with a lift concept. Doesn't look like a high-rise building right now, but during its time it was. But as you can see, fashion does not endure sentimentality, and all those details that the first architect came up with went out the window. It was made over again. Eventually, the wrought iron verandas were replaced with existing concrete ones. The projecting concrete balconets were put in place, the window hoods, which are still evident today. So what does it look like today? You won't recognize it from that, but you may, if you've been through the streets of Cape Town, recognize it by that photograph. It became the Granddaddy Hotel. It only opened its doors in 2008, and the owners managed to hold on to the Victorian style. I'm just going to show you the metropole in London of its day. Now, all right, twice the size, but you can see where they're going on this, a very sort of similar architectural style. And they retained the look inside as well. Not quite the black and white floors of the Savoy Hotel, but that lift is the same lift that was operating back then and does today, and has the claim to fame of being the oldest functioning lift in the whole of the Western Cape area. It's very beautiful inside. It's really filled with history until you get to the roof. When you get to the roof, this is what you see. I love the way that the new owners have done this. They've taken the wonder of the old Victorian era and they've just thrown on top this marvel. They acquired for themselves 7 American caravans, 1930s, and these Airstream trailers, as they're called, are extraordinary. Each one was decorated by a South African interior designer, and I know that Tracy Lynch was one of the first ones to be appointed. And each one has got a distinctly South African interior design. Now, I'm not going to comment on that interior design. I'm going to let you just look at them and enjoy. They certainly push the edges of technology and architecture, but you can see the South African theme running through it. They really are a joy to have a look at, quite something like a museum. On top of that, they created the open-air rooftop terrace, which is very much a drinking spot in Cape Town, and rather quaintly, an open-air cinema right on top of the roof. And that's when the story of the Granddaddy Hotel should end, except that 48 hours ago, we stumbled upon that. Time marches on. It looks like the Granddaddy Hotel is about to enter yet another chapter in its history because it's for sale. It's going on sale with the auctioneer's hammer. So if you want to buy a hotel, I see, come down to Cape Town on the 29th of June and you too can acquire for yourself the Granddaddy Hotel. Let's now take a moment to go through the eyes of Lady Anne Barnard. Her watercolors are an incredible kind of way of showing the history of Cape Town. It was the watercolor equivalent of photography today. And thanks to her, we have some very accurate depictions of what it was like to be there during her time. Lady Anne Barnard was Scottish. She was the daughter of James Lindsay, the 5th Earl of Balcarres, and married to Andrew Barnard, an officer and a gentleman in the Cape Colony at the time. Apart from her watercolors, she loved the Cape Town area, but she missed England very much indeed. So she wanted to bring some of that English memory into her life. Now, I want you to have a look at this. She was a lockdown princess, if ever there was one. She painted this from her room inside the castle, which is where she spent most of her time before she built her English house. But you can actually see the perspective. You can imagine her being in the castle, sort of looking out over the Cape Town area as it looked back then. Very accurate. But this was the love of her life. She created with her husband an English house, and it has the claim to fame of being the first English house built in South Africa. Those paintings, middle and on the extreme right-hand side, were her paintings from her veranda at the time, and that's what it looked like on the left. This is the future Vineyard Hotel. It was taken over in 1844 by a merchant, a very wealthy merchant called Billingsley, and he then turned it into a double-story establishment. And then in 1894, another Scot, James Mitchell, took it over, and it became known as, for the first time, the Vineyard. Lady Anne Barnard used to refer to her vineyard retreat, but it was only now that it was formally called the Vineyard, and it was turned into a proper hospitality industry element, a hotel, under the sharp eyes of what I think must be the first lady general manager in hotels in Cape Town. There aren't that many lady general managers in this industry, but this one was called Mrs. O'Sullivan. I have yet to find out what her first name was, but she was the general manager. And from what I can understand, not exactly a wilting flower. Now, Rudyard Kipling stayed there in 1898, and he wrote this in his journal. The hotel is kept by 3 thoroughly acid female devils, one with a moustache and no figure. who have made things just as unpleasant all round for the guests on the 12 hours of daylight would let them. But in spite of it all, we all got on very well. In 1948, a family of hoteliers called the Turkstra family bought the Vineyard Hotel and modernized it. But what we remember the Turkstras for is something I'm going to show you in a moment, which is the fountain, which sits in the courtyard and the garden on the other side of the hotel. But this is what the Vineyard looks like today. And it is owned by the Swiss hotelier family, the Pertussis, who I mentioned to you earlier before. It is the same family that own Eau de Verre, and this is most beautiful modern hotels with lots of little hints to its origin from the Victorian era. I stumbled upon an architectural report, I suppose, during the time of the renovation. And the architect made reference to the need to retain some of those aspects from history, including, and I quote, the bullseye pattern architraves, the bead and quirk mouldings, sweeping timber staircase, the moulded timber roof brackets, and the sash windows. And you can see hints of it all the way through the Vineyard Hotel. That's the modern door front entrance, if you like, down on the left. But if you look at the back of the hotel, you can imagine Lady Anne Barnard kind of moving her way through that veranda area. That's the part that she would remember. Inside, a definite nod to the Victorian era, that big photograph on the left. If you look at the wall on the back, that is Lady Anne Barnard herself with lots of memorabilia. This hotel, the Vineyard, has held on to that heritage, and they have a sort of almost homage to Lady Anne Barnard in different parts of the hotel. On the right-hand side down the bottom, that's the dining area, which is quite near the entrance, which goes right out into that garden. And speaking of gardens, the gardens are very Victorian. Lady Anne Barnard was a bit of a green fingers lass, and the owners have retained the incredible gardens that were established. All the detail, it's a marvel and a joy to walk through. And she retained it back then, and they've kind of grown it into the modern era. There is the fountain I mentioned that was first put up in 1948. The Turkstra brought it, and it still stands as a nod to the history of this beautiful hotel. This is what the streets of Cape Town looked like in the year 1895. That is Adderley Street. Adderley Street, one of the most important streets of Cape Town today, and going back in history, used to be called Herengracht. It was the main drag, if you like, that when, in fact, look right in the back of that image, you can see the boats on the harbour. And that street, Herengracht before, comes all the way up to Company Gardens. And that was where anybody who was anybody would walk the streets. They used to call it a gentleman's walk because people used to promenade. The ladies on the right-hand side were the society ladies of the time, very like they just walked off the streets of London, but those are South African lasses during our time. And if you think for a minute back to the Savoy, and I mentioned to you about Escoffier and the Ritz idea of encouraging the ladies in, this is their legacy is that they made it possible for the ladies of society to be seen and be appropriately seen having tea in these grand hotels. The Victorian era hotel that always shows its details, still does, is a Kimberley Hotel, which is a very small, very modest, but very historic hotel smack in the middle of Cape Town. So named because the horse-drawn carts, and you can see in the image there they are lined up, used to gather here and stay en route for Kimberley, because of course now we're into the period of time which was the diamond fields and the gold fields of South Africa. Barney Bonato was one of the biggest names of this time, and apparently he used to come to this hotel quite frequently, and I'm going to show you how he is remembered inside. But Kimberley is 830 kilometers northeast of Cape Town as the crow flies. And during the time, and I've mentioned to you before, is the most important feature of a hotel in the Victorian era, certainly in this country, was the bar. I found this postcard when we popped in not that long ago to have a look. It comes from their museum section. You can see the hotel as it was and look at the balustrading, very Victorian, the detail on the roof. But look in particular at the bar. Look at the clock. This was the photograph that was taken last week. There it is again with the clock in the middle. Hasn't changed. Hasn't changed much at all. The rooms on the left-hand side, have you got the stairs, these little narrow staircases, which are pretty much the old ones. What amused me was the actual thresholds, the bedroom, clearly from Victorian era, because you had to be a little bit smaller to get through, not the sort of modern thresholds of today. There's Barney Bonato, smack in the middle of the photograph up top, and this very bar was where he used to lean his elbow and have a beer or whatever his drink was before going off himself to Kimberley. The restaurant on the right-hand side, well, it's probably not what I'd call five-star dining. There's the same dining room taken from inside, looking out on the view. If you do the research, they say that it's Barney's Bistro, and their offering of the day is a chip roll. So probably not the right place to go to if you're kind of into gourmet dining, but a hotel filled with history. And there is the delightful general manager who owns and runs it, Dean, who did me the favor of a photograph outside his establishment. Now, stand aside, I'm coming across to Gauteng. The story of one of the most interesting hotels in Johannesburg is the story of the Carlton Hotel. And believe it or not, the Carlton Hotel story begins in London with, again, Queen Victoria, specifically the Diamond Jubilee procession. In 1897, the Queen Victorian Diamond Jubilee was the item on the calendar that year. And it was a big fight to get the best place to be able to see it. And the place to watch was the corner of Haymarket and Pall Mall. At the time, it was a building site. Her Majesty's Theatre had stood there prior, and this had been demolished. And as soon as that procession was over, it made way for the building of what was to become one of the most beautiful, opulent hotels in London of its time, certainly of the Victorian era. In 1899, the Carlton Hotel of London opened its doors. The Carlton Hotel was to become the inspiration for another famous Carlton Hotel 6,000 miles away on the Witwatersrand gold fields. Before I bring you to South Africa, this is what the Carlton Hotel looked like when it opened its doors in London. Have a look at the architecture, and there you go with the ubiquitous Palm Court terrace, and you can see London society enjoying it back in that era. And this is the gentleman who came from East London in England and who had a dream of enormous proportions. And what he wanted to do was to recreate the favorite parts of his London in his chosen place in Johannesburg. There's his diamond fields, and that is what he was looking at in Johannesburg during the time. He was a frustrated actor. He loved the Victorian dramas and the melodramas, and in fact he even acted on stage in Kimberley, so much did he love it. But he wanted to be able to bring the best of London to South Africa. So he dreamt of luxury hotels and theatres. Now the year 1895 was a boom year for the Rand. And remember, Johannesburg was just a fledgling 9 years old. But Barney Bonato gave instructions, even though this was the reality of Johannesburg, to build for him the biggest playhouse in the world, that was the actual instruction, and a palatial hotel. In 1898, on the left-hand side, excavations began, and it was a heck of an excavation with steel structures that went up, except that the whole building site and the big dream was spoiled somewhat in 1899. By that, the Anglo-American War arrived, and the whole project came to a grinding halt. And something that's often recorded in history books is that there was a crane that was actually being worked. Now, the crane itself was causing a lot of fuss and bother because of the era that it was, and it remained on the roof of the Carlton Hotel building site for many, many years. The hotel represents the transitional period because Queen Victoria, remember, died in 1901. So it represented the transitional period between the Victorian era and the Edwardian period, because it was to open its doors in 1906. At the time, the newspapers were aflutter. They called it the most extraordinary luxurious hotel they'd ever seen. It cost £750,000 to build, and they termed it the first official skyscraper, which is a term that had not entered our language until then. Here's what the Star newspaper had to say about it. This is not merely a hotel, it's a miniature city. It has frontages on 4 important streets and towers so high that one imagines it would be not impossible to step off its roof onto a passing cloud. Well, the clouds must be quite low in Johannesburg. What is interesting about the building is it was the first time that architects and builders was to claim space below ground level. And there are 3 stories in the Carlton Hotel, that we now know that, but at the time it was extraordinary to go below. And they put, of all things, a Turkish spa down below. The steel structure was disguised with masonry and crowned with a massive cornice. And it certainly caused a flutter in society. The public marveled at the Victorian technology. It had heating and waterborne sewage, and everything that was Victorian and modern was thrown at it, coupled with things like a plug-in centralized vacuum cleaning system, which was brand new pioneering thinking from America that they introduced as well. Underneath the hotel, there were shops. And one of those shops was Sidarsky, who sold ostrich plumes. Of course you do that in that particular era. There was also a very fashionable material shop, a jewelry shop, and some of the shops were taken away to make way for the Carlton Centre Bioscope, as they called it then. Now remember what was happening in this year that the hotel opened its doors. 1906 was also the day, or the year rather, of the very first Sunday Times, and electric trams were to come to Johannesburg. So there was a lot of innovation and activity going on in the development of Johannesburg. In 1922, financial disaster. Don't need to tell you about the Depression. And the Carlton just didn't make it, and it went on auction. It was sold for a paltry £235,000, which was a huge loss, but it survived. And the new owners continued to build up and create the hotel that was to stay in that way for a long time. The ubiquitous Palm Court was there. Of course, you know, this is the Victorian era that we had to bring into South Africa. And it stayed, and it became the center of social life for Johannesburg, in fact, for South Africa. I found this is the advertisement you can see on the left is more from the 1950s going to 1960s, but the menu on the right was from, as you can see, January 1963. And I love the fact that you could get a grilled lamb chop and cutlets for R1.05. Those were the days. The social scene at the Carlton Hotel was absolutely incredible. You had kings and queens and celebrities and Hollywood people. It's almost urban legends, because apparently there were also undercover spies and con men who used to meet in the lounges and do their business. And one of the newspapers described it as an oasis of sheer luxury on the raw Highveld. In 1963, the story was to come to an end, and it closed its doors forever. Despite all that you see in front of you, it just never ever quite hung on to it financially. So it closed and demolition began. And it took an entire year to get rid of the Carlton Hotel, such a heavy and strong structure it was. In 1963, the year it was demolished, was the same year that 3 blocks away, a plan was hatched to bring around the next chapter of the Carlton Hotel. The players in the story were Harry Oppenheimer with Anglo American and SA Breweries. And they had this vision of creating a super block. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. The super block was built, and it became the Carlton Centre. It had 50 floors. Panorama views of Johannesburg, which was called the top of, it was the top of Africa, I think it was called. I remember when I first came from England, it was one of the things that I did. I'm sure many of you have been up in that lift, 50 floors up to go and see Johannesburg. And that's what the shopping centre looked like on the right-hand side. It was even then an extraordinary piece of architecture and a very opulent hotel. The hotel itself was twice the size of the original Carlton Hotel, and it opened its doors in 1973. Society, modern society, business people used to go there all the way through. And even then, it never managed to hold on to its finances, I suppose. And eventually, in the year 1998, it closed its doors for good. It's still there, but this is what it looks like right now. It's so sad. It's like a ghost hotel, and you can almost hear and feel the whispers of the history of Carlton. Even Barney Bernard will be hanging around that ballroom if he possibly could, to see the beauty of the Carlton Hotel, but so sadly like this. Maybe somebody will come along and buy it all up, and we'll go again with the next chapter of the Carlton Hotel. I have 2 more stories and 3 more hotels to share with you, but this one is one of my favorites because it is the story of the great cruise liner clash. 1857. At the time, we had 2 cruise liners. The Union Line was contracted to transport mail to South Africa, leaving Southampton on a Thursday. And on the other side was Donald Curry, who owned the Castle Packet Company, and he had 4 ships. And they would go from Liverpool round to Calcutta, and they used to sail around the Cape of Good Hope. Then the Suez Canal opened in 1869, so the Castle Packet Company also started transporting mail to South Africa. So they had these 2 great big lines who were coming to the same little colony. Now, in 1872, the Prime Minister was John Maltino, and he didn't want a monopoly, so he brought together a contract. He awarded them both the rights to do the shipping routes, made the tickets interchangeable, but put a no-merge clause into the contract. So it got pretty busy. Union, Castle, busy going from London on the turn of the century, and here they are in the Cape Town harbour, backwards and forwards. Now remember what was going on at that time, again, referring you to the gold fields and the diamond fields. This rather extraordinary little book was the booklet that was handed out to first-class passengers on the ship, specifically on the Castle Line. And the name of the book is South Africa and How to Reach It by the Castle Line. The green is the back cover. It calls it the shortest route to the gold fields of South Africa. And it was all about bringing the people through and looking after them here in this country. And they just kept on coming, and they kept on coming. So you had 2 great big competing shipping lines. How do they compete then if there was a no-merge clause? Well, they had to find a way to outdo one another, and that came with things like speed, luxury on board, better service. And then it dawned upon them, if you really want to compete, build a hotel. And the first person to get to that level was the Union company that built the Grand Hotel, one of the most glorious pieces of Victorian architecture that we've seen in South Africa. It opened its doors in 1885. It stood on the corners of Adderley and Strand and St. George's Street, and it was designed by Charles Freeman, one of the big architectural names. And it stood as a grand hotel for many, many years. You can see for yourself what I mean about the Victorian details. Look at the roof and the details and double levels of balconies. And it kept going until the 1950s. And that photograph on the left actually was taken during that time. And it had this evolution. The interior, I wished I could get a photograph of it, because I've heard or read that there was this extraordinary mosaic floor emblazoned with the arms of the Cape Colony inside the entrance, but I can't find any evidence anywhere. At that time, you might be asking, what was the other shipping line doing, the Castle shipping line, which was owned by Donald Curry? And the answer to your question is he built, or at least he took over, Mount Nelson. But I'm going to tell you that story in a minute. Stay with this one for a moment. What happened to this extraordinary hotel? Well, the Grand was not to stay with us, because in the background, something happened. The 2 companies did merge in the year 1900, 1 year before Queen Victoria died. So the no merge clause clearly was taken away and out, and the 2 came together. Donald Curry became the inevitable leader of these 2 companies, and the mail ships continued to bring our mail and passengers all the way to Cape Town. I just want to share a personal memory with you there, because when I'd come out from England, it was one of the very first things that my family did in 1970. And we were aboard the S.A. Aranya and then the Pendennis Castle to experience Cape Town through our English eyes for the very, very first time. What happened to the Grand, you ask? Well, this happened. On the very corner, the exact same footprint, this is what stands. Woolies. Woolies is there. And maybe they were trying to clone the sort of feel and the architectural style of it, but oh, it's so sad. The hotel has gone and we have this modern shop in its place. One piece of good news for you, somebody back then was smart enough to realize that the hotel was rather special. So here's the Grand Hotel as it is right now. Well, the facade anyway. It was rescued piece by piece, and it now is reborn and lives on the premises. The Grand Hotel lives in the complex, the Grand West Casino of Goodwood. So you can go and have a look at it anytime you choose, and it's exactly like it stood all those years ago. So what about the other shipping liner? Well, Mount Nelson is their story and their legacy and their claim to fame. And I don't need to tell you, it's one that stood the test of time. The beautiful watercolor you can see on the left was actually done by a lady who was to grow up on the grounds of where Mount Nelson now stands. She was a direct line of descendants. And just to go way back in history, originally the piece of ground was given to a Dutch baron, Peter van Oudtshoorn van Reede, as of Oudtshoorn fame. And he was on his way back to Cape Town to take over office for the Cape Colony, but unfortunately died en route, in a ship en route. So the ground that he was bequeathed as part of his package, I suppose, kind of went off in a different tangent. Eventually, that same ground, and by the way, there's the architectural representation of Mount Nelson as it became, landed up as being opened in 1899 as Mount Nelson. Donald Curry behind it, this was his claim to fame, and it was his mission to build or create the most glamorous London equivalent Victorian era hotel he could in South Africa, and he succeeded. When it opened its doors, it caused an absolute stir. This image fascinates me. The front door hasn't changed too much, but it must be the oldest image of people arriving with the horses and the carriages. And here's just a couple more of the front door image, going through time a little bit. So he offered luxury, he offered style, he made it quite clear that there was no better place. And remember, it was only for first class passengers, but he enticed them to get onto his cruise liner and then come and stay at his hotel. There was a slight fly in the ointment. War was looming. Mount Nelson opened its doors in the first half of 1899. In October 1899, the Anglo-Boer War broke out. Now, Mount Nelson continued to stay open for business, but it kind of changed in flavor, as you can see by this image. All the flags, and the gentleman walking with his Victorian lady in the gardens is dressed in the militaria. The military moved in. Kitchener, Buller, Roberts all took up residence. In fact, the fountain that you could just about make out in the image is still named the Kitchener Fountain. A very young Winston Churchill, a war reporter, came aboard a mail ship and then stayed at Mount Nelson and declared in his writings to be quite the most superb of hotels, comparable with that in London. The garden view, you can see it again just slightly later in time, actually hasn't changed, even in modern day kind of thing. It's still very much the same thing. There it is. And I've got one more image of the garden side of Mount Nelson. One piece of history worth sharing with you is how it got its name, the Pink Lady. It's often called Nellie, but it truly is one of the Victorian grand old ladies. And this particular thing, Nellie, was called the Pink Lady because of her coating. Her original life, she was yellow and green, and then through another period of time, she became ochre, and believe it or not, oxblood red, and then pink. It was the year 1918. It was the end of World War I, and the then general manager was an Italian chap who decided he wanted to depict and bring about a feeling of peace in the hotel. So he had an exact hue of pink put together to paint the walls of Mount Nelson, and it is a color that remains to this day. And when they do renovate and paint, that color code is still followed. If you're wondering, by the way, that is a bunch of ladies from something called the International Women's Club of Cape Town. And we often do visit the grand hotels of Cape Town. But you can see quite clearly behind the group the color of the pink. What about a different part of the creation? Now, this itself goes back not to Queen Victoria, but to the Prince of Wales, because in 1925, he had a grand procession that went all the way from the Grand Parade, all the way through town. What was here in Gracht is now Adderley, to Mount Nelson, through Mount Nelson, and up to the Company Gardens. And Mount Nelson did what every self-respecting hotel would do at the time. They built themselves a grand entrance so that the Prince of Wales could have his procession in an appropriate environment. Here are 3 images of what is still the front entrance of Mount Nelson, a glorious piece of work. And if you nip around the other side of it, that's what it looks like today. There's the same bunch of ladies from the International Women's Club of Cape Town. Oh, and the buildings you can see on the right-hand side, it might cross your mind to wonder, where does the word Nelson get its history? Nelson himself, as in Horatio, never stayed in the hotel. But the piece of ground was familiar territory to him, and those buildings on the right-hand side, he stayed in lodgings, I suppose, once upon a time. In fact, I think he visited Cape Town twice in one of those buildings on the right-hand side. They have renovated those buildings, and they remain part of the hotel. Let's have a little look inside Mount Nelson. And you can see from the photographs that they've managed to retain practically the entire structure and the decor of the Victorian era. Then we have the dining hall in the year 1900, and there it is as it exists today. Look at the roof structure. They've absolutely kept it intact, along with the windows and the details. This is a dining area come lounge. If you look to the back of the photograph, you can see what is now the lounge area, and today is the Planet Bar. Sort of behind me, if you like, the perspective is the Planet Ballroom, where they have lots of big events. Here is the lounge itself that leads out onto the terrace in the year 1900, and there it is today, ready for the very famous Mount Nelson teas that they produce. But you can see for yourself, they've kept the ceiling, they've kept the pillars. You look on the right-hand side, that little pub sign with Nelson hanging on it is still filled with a feeling of history. When you go in that little pub, you can still remember what it would have been like all those years ago. My last story to share with you of the Victorian era is a little unexpected, because we are moving away from the cities to the Karoo. Not the most likely place you would expect to find a Victorian era grand old lady, but this one has to be shared. It's about as Victorian can get. Right in the middle of the Karoo, and it came about because of one man with a passion and a dream. Often is the way, isn't it? His name was James Logan. He was a Scot. He landed up in South Africa by mistake because he was shipwrecked. He was shipwrecked at Simon's Bay, as it was called back then, now Simon's Town, decided to stay. He became a porter on the Cape Town Railway, and eventually worked his way up to superintendent and tows Raffier. And he did what not everybody does, but he, the Scot, fell in love with the Karoo and said, "This is the place to build my dream." Barney Bonato had a dream of a palatial hotel and the largest playhouse in the world. He had a dream to create a Victorian village, and he did. So he married a lass called Emma, and in this part of the world, he created a Victorian village, which you could be forgiven looks more like it looks more like a Disney village, but it's not. Every single particle of this little village was created by the man in strict Victorian style. He built a farm called Tweedside, not Tweer, and immediately this man was a Victorian man of innovation. He created the actual village as a Victorian health resort. But he did extraordinary things, like he dropped boreholes. He planted thousands of fruit trees, which everybody said was a terrible thing to do. So everybody's advice was against it, but he did it. He had the longest private telephone line in South Africa between Mikey's Fontaine and his farm Tweedside. The technology went on. If you look at the photograph on the bottom, he created streetlights in the Victorian style, and he brought about waterborne sewage. Now, because his fruit trees were so successful, he had to have some sort of transport. So he did what everybody does. They built their own railway station, don't they? This stands exactly in the same Victorian style. And this is what he used to move his fruit produce away, and became part of the charm that is Mikey's Fontaine. Then he set about the business of the hotel. 1899, that year comes up over and over again. But he built Hotel Milner in exactly the same time when the Boer War was happening. So from the very beginning, it was almost like a military hotel. He had 10,000 British troops that were camping in and around the hotel, and that turret that you can see in the middle became the official lookout post for the area. Logan himself was a bit of a man of the war. He put together an equestrian group, I suppose, a troop, and he did all sorts of brave stuff in the area. So he was very, very well known in his time. The Boer-Brit theme runs very strongly at the hotel. Now, we visited it not so long ago, and that's my son Ryan, who, my husband is Afrikaans and I'm English, so he found this poster inside the Lord Milner Hotel and went, that's me, the Boer meets the Brit. But the whole of the history of Mikey's Fontaine and the Lord Milner Hotel is built on this duality, if you like. It is a truly classic Victorian hotel, as you can see for yourselves from the balustrades and the details and the turrets and the attention to detail. If you go inside the hotel, you can see the Victorian decor and details have been retained. It looked like this pretty much in Logan's time, and this is a very recent photograph that was taken about a week ago. Logan was a marketing man, and the pub, which looks exactly like this today, was one of the biggest attractions, and he set about trying to get people to come and visit his hotel. So what he did was he got hold of the idea as how can he get the people to come on the mail ship to come and visit this little destination in Mikey's Fontaine, and he did. He sold it as a destination, and it paid off. The kind of people that visited the hotel included Lord Randolph Churchill, who was Winston's dad, Cecil John Rhodes, Rudyard Kipling again, the same gent who had the altercation with the lady at the Vineyard Hotel, the Sultan of Zanzibar, British admirals such as Rawson and Nicholson, Olive Schreiner, who loved it so much that she kept on coming back and rented a cottage next to the post office, which still stands, and the astronomer Sir David Gill, who was known for measuring basically astronomical distances, including the distance between Earth and the Sun. But this Victorian era, with these Victorian figures I'm describing, would spend their time in this very place. The owners have retained it. That is the pharmacy. The whispers of alchemy still exist. That is the little Victorian church that was built and still exists on the backside of the hotel. And these photographs were taken very recently. You can see the details are still there. The modern owner, by the way, himself was a traveler. He is a hotelier par excellence, David Rawdon, and he himself has traveled around the world. So he brought many of his collectibles and put them in to match the style of the hotel. No, not a Victorian bus, but you can see what I mean about it really being the Boer meets Brit sort of theme kind of thing as you visit everywhere. We leave Mikey's Fontaine and the Karoo, and we come back once more to where we began. Queen Victoria, in this photograph on holiday somewhere in some remote park, definitely doesn't look like London. And I have to ask the question, what is it about us in South Africa, all these miles away, that is so interested in Queen Victoria, in the Victorian era, that we should create all these hotels in the same design? I think a lot of it has to do with the sheer timing of the people who are coming out mainly from England and from Europe. But it is another thing. It is the fascination with what we know is historically one of the more interesting times in architecture, innovation, and growth. And for me, it's absolutely ironic that we associate this time with the fun and the social world of glitz and glamour and hotels and progress in food and wine and things like that. And yet equally so, the woman behind it, the queen behind it, is also known as being quite somber, had her entire nation in mourning clothes for goodness knows how many years. And we also speak about the Victorian prudishness. So it's an absolute contrast and conflict. But in the hotel industry, it's not. It's a time of glamour and glitz and extremes and excesses, which many of the hoteliers here in South Africa so wanted to emulate. There was a man born literally a couple of years after Queen Victoria died, Alfred Leslie Rouse. And he wrote, "One might regard architecture as history arrested in stone." That is part of it for me. There is a captured sense of time in the buildings that we look at in the hotels. But because a hotel is so much more than bricks and mortar, these establishments allow us to think back to what it was like before. There's been written words that says that people will forget what you say and they'll forget all sorts of things, but they will not forget how you made them feel. And when you walk into a hotel, it's as much about bricks and mortar as it is about how you feel when you walk into that establishment. And if I look at Queen Victoria's grand old ladies, when you walk in, you feel that, don't you? You feel the history, you feel the culture from a bygone era, and we can't get enough of it. We seem to want to know more about it, at least I do anyway. So as we reflect on this, we're looking back 125 years and we remain fascinated. 125 years into the future, when we get off our spaceship and clamber into our little remote hotel room, which might be bobbling somewhere either under the planet Mars surface or above the planet Mars surface, I don't know. But we look back and we say, what was it like to go to a hotel 125 years ago? And by then it'll be the year 2147. And I ask you, how will it look and what will they say? And the interesting thought, and it'll be incredibly, I imagine, different. And yet there'll be an aspect which will not be different. I'll put money on the table that we'll still be able to look back on the grand old ladies of Queen Victoria's era, and they will still be around delivering hospitality to all who wish to come across their thresholds. There's an interesting thought, which I'll leave you with.